So here's something you might not know. I didn't know either until Byron pointed it out. The Western Cape has its own bloody constitution. It was made into effect back in 1998. So Byron, thank you for bringing this to my attention. What is so great about this constitution for the Western Cape?
The Western Cape is the only province in South Africa that actually has a constitution, and in that constitution, it requires the Western Cape provincial government to provide certain basic features for its population. One of those is actually around policing and community safety.
I mean, if you look at Chapter 8 of the Western Cape Constitution, it says the policing functions of the Western Cape government, and it says not quite, it's weird. So it says the Western Cape government is entitled to monitor police conduct, assess effectiveness of visible policing, oversee the efficiency of the police service, promote good relations between the police and the community, and right at the end, must make recommendations to the National Cabinet Minister responsible for policing. So in other words, they sort of have an oversight role of policing in the Western Cape, and if they want to make recommendations, they must speak to Twat in the Hat himself, Bheki Cele. Now, we both know Bheki Cele is an absolute moron and someone who should be in a mental asylum rather than the Minister of Police. The DA is of the same view, obviously, so therefore they are already ramping up the efforts to gain control of policing in the Western Cape. And recently on News 24, they go back to a speech Jordan Hill-Lewis, the mayor of Cape Town, said, where he basically says the ultimate goal is for the city and the province to have control over all aspects of the policing in the Western Cape to protect local communities. What do you say about that?
So as lawyers, we have to interpret the language and we have to interrogate the language. The first thing is you can obviously see from the Western Cape Constitution that it provides for the oversight function of the policing and the effectiveness of the policing in that province. So in this instance, what they've done is they've had their oversight. They've obviously monitored the policing and they've determined that the policing was poor. With that being said, what happens when you identify failings in your policing? Well, the Constitution goes a little bit further and says recommendations must be made. And those recommendations they've obviously made to national governments, which has increased the number of policing, increased the effectiveness and the professionalism of the policing. And all of those things have gone unheeded and the national government has ignored their pleas. So now what do you do? I mean, if you know you've got a problem, you've made the recommendations and those recommendations have not been affected, you know that you still have the ongoing problem because that's your oversight function. The logical solution is, if you're not prepared to do it, I will. And so the next recommendation, the current recommendations are, if you're unable to do it, a national government, give it to us and we will affect it internally. Now, we've already seen that in terms of the Western Cape Highway Patrol. The Western Cape obviously provided its own highway patrol services with drone functionality in order to improve road safety. And now the Western Cape wants to take that one step further and actually have its own police force.
Yeah, so I think the Highway Patrol is worth mentioning, right? Because it's by far the most high-tech thing to come out of South African policing in who knows when, since Jan van Riebeeck arrived on these particular shores. I mean, they have drones that can see license plates from kilometers away and send you details of the owner, whether there are any fines outstanding, whether there's an arrest warrant out for the driver of that car, whether there are any issues with the passengers of the car. I mean, it's a really high-tech system that the Western Cape has come up with. This is obviously done under the Metro Police, not the SAPS, because they don't control the SAPS whatsoever. But one can assume if the DA does take control of SAPS in the Western Cape, this will be rolled out to SAPS. Because the big myth in South Africa is not that the police are useless, it's that the management of police is very useless. We know police officers, Byron, good people, people who want to help, people who want to change things, but they really can't. It's like built within the system is this redundancy of action because the system is just so corrupted and so pointless at the end of the day. All thanks to Bheki Cele and the ANC overall. But one can assume that if SAPS is devolved and provinces do control the police departments, IFP in KwaZulu-Natal, the Coalition, Gauteng, and things like that, and most importantly, the DA in the Western Cape, the police has no option but to be a lot better at their jobs. It just makes complete and utterly perfect sense to me. We've created a brand new insurance brokerage called, funny enough, Morning Shot Insurance Brokers. So if you're interested in saving money on insurance, number one, but most importantly, having a Zoom with me and my wonderful face, why not send me your insurance schedule to ramon@morningshot.co.za? Let's chat. Maybe we can help each other save money and deliver superior service, because that's what we're all about here at Morning Shot.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the main gripes that the DA has in the Western Cape is that it's often criticized for the crime and the inefficiencies in policing in that province. A lot of people say, if you govern that province, how come the policing is still inefficient? And, it's important for people actually to understand where SAPS derives its powers and functions from. There's two main areas that it gets its powers and functions from. The first is Section 205 of the Constitution, and the second is the South African Police Service Act of 1995. Now, that legislation dictates that first, the national policing policy is dictated by the National Commissioner for the Accounting Office of SAPS, and the National Commissioner, we all know, has to then report to the Minister of Policing. Now, historically, we know that the Commissioner and the Minister of Policing hasn't got on very well, which has obviously led to the National Commissioner being fired last year, and we now have a new National Commissioner who is basically a, should we say, Bheki Cele fan. Now, SAPS's actual objectives is to prevent, combat, and investigate crime, it's to maintain public order, it's to maintain and secure the inhabitants and their property, and uphold and enforce the law. Because SAPS is mandated to comply those functions in accordance with Section 205 of the Constitution, those abilities cannot be devolved to local municipal law enforcement, or what we would call peace officers. So that makes the role of the Western Cape government, who only has control over their metro police and their law enforcement officers or peace officers, a lot more challenging, because whilst they can enforce local bylaws, what they can't do is they can't prosecute or investigate crimes. They can't maintain public order, even though they try to, and they can't uphold and enforce the law, specifically the criminal law. That means it's very hard for the Western Cape government to take into effect any of those kind of areas, even though they are trying to fulfill those functions in line with their mandate of what they're allowed to do and the ambience of the current acts. But really what they need is they need to actually have these as devolved powers. Problem comes in that those powers are mandated, according to Section 205 of the Constitution, to reside solely in the exclusivity of SAPS. So in theory, this would require a constitutional change.
And the DA is quite happy to do that. Unfortunately for them, the president did say that he's not for devolution because it goes against the Constitution. And Bheki Cele, when asked for comment on stories such as these, he says the DA must stop shouting and just go to court already. So he says, stop shouting, go to court, let the court tell me what to do, but I'm busy at the moment, so I'm not talking to them. Very mature. Well, people in the Cape Flats are dying from drug overdoses and gang killings and rapes and all sorts of things. Bheki Cele is just too busy to deal with policing issues in the Western Cape. Tells you everything you need to know, really.
This is exactly in line with what we've seen from Bheki Cele prior. You may recall that during the lockdown, he was trying to enforce regulations that didn't exist. You may recall, obviously, the enforcement of the beach wars, where he was pushing filming crew off the Cape Town beaches that actually had permits to be there. And many people pointed out at the time that he actually had no ambit to do that, and yet he didn't really care. So we do have a policing stooge or a policing minister that knows absolutely jack about the law, but he doesn't really care because he's the minister, and the National Commissioner basically has to enforce what he says. Now, that's not actually the role of the National Commissioner, but as we all know, what the ANC tends to do is they install a stooge, and the stooge just follows the wishes of their masters. Can't really expect otherwise, can you?
No, you can't, but this is by far the most important stories of the coming year, because if the DA does this right, if the Constitutional Court agrees with them, it fundamentally changes so many things about South Africa, not in terms of safety, but in terms of devolving other powers to the provinces. Those who want it, of course. Because if 2024 comes along and the ANC loses Gauteng, they lose KZN, they definitely will lose Western Cape, of course. Those provinces can really not secede in an official sense, but can really have their own mandate to run it as they see fit in far more ways than currently, and that's why it's so important that this thing actually does succeed.
Yeah, so my take on this is I don't see it as being successful without a constitutional change. Yeah, the DA will obviously be in favour of that, but none of the other stooges will be. I can't see the EFF getting behind this. It goes against the whole communist central command idea, which obviously the EFF support. Without the EFF support, there's no ways the DA could get this. I mean, they would need significant ANC support, and that's not going to happen. With that being said, if it did happen, the biggest problem will be is that it does pave way for devolution and the potential ceding of a province, which may start in the Western Cape but won't end there.
No, certainly not. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, if the Concord says yes, it still gives Parliament like 2 years to come up with the legislation. And that legislation will probably be botched and nonsense, very much like the Electoral Act reform, where independents can become politicians instead of joining a political party. That whole act is completely flawed and goes against what the Constitutional Court says. So now there has to be another case to the Constitutional Court to render that piece of legislation redundant so that they have to start all over again. It's not a thing that will be solved within a year. But if the processes are set in place today, in 3-4 years' time, it could be a reality. And I'm here for that.
Yeah, so the reason the Electoral Act has been botched is because what it does do is it provides quite a heavy weight to the PR system. And that what it will actually do is it will stop the whole kind of PR or proportional representation type thing that we currently see within the country. This is the idea that you have certain people who lose the basic votes and they still end up getting a seat within chambers. We see this a lot within the EFF. We see it in some places that are exclusively DA elected, and yet the ANC still get that PR type vote. So in effect, what this would actually do is it would limit the ANC's power, which is why it's been very keen to botch that legislation. Any central act that devolves power away from central government and that of the ANC generally tends to get botched. There is no reason to believe that any form of devolution or policing power wouldn't be the same.
Indeed, indeed. Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Let us know in the comments down below. Do you trust the DA with your policing, or do you trust the twat in the hat? Those are the only two options you have at the moment. Sounds a lot like democracy. Thanks for watching. Cheers.